Hello, and welcome back to Let's Get Lit. In today's episode, we're going to be going over chapters 11 and 12 of J.D. Salinger's classic, The Catcher in the Rye. See where he continues next, shall we? Alright, let's start in on chapter 11. Chapter 11 starts out with Holden walking out of the lavender room, and all of a sudden Jane Gallagher comes to his mind. He is so unable to get her off his mind that he sits down in a vomit-colored chair and begins to think about her. At first, he begins to think about her and Stradlater in Ed Banksy's car, and he really didn't like that. However, he tells the reader that he knows Jane like a book and she wouldn't have let Stradlater do anything to her. He then goes on to tell the reader a little bit of history about him and Jane, how that besides them playing checkers, she was very fond of athletes and athletic sports. He says that the whole summer they were together, they played tennis in the morning and golf in the afternoon. He said their relationship never got physical, but you don't really have to get physical to get to know someone. He goes on to say that the reason he met her is because of her Doberman Pinscher and that this dog would always go to the bathroom on their front lawn. Holden's mother did not like this, and so she raised a big fuss to Jane's mom. A couple of days later, Holden saw Jane laying on her stomach next to the swimming pool at the club they go to, and he goes over to say hi to her. When he says hello, she doesn't even bother to give him the time of day, and in fact, she's a little cold towards him. He says it takes a little bit, but he finally gets her to talk to him, and he tells her that he doesn't mind where his dog goes to the bathroom in their yard. Holden goes on to say that after this, they become friends. He played golf with her that same afternoon, and Holden remembers that she lost 8 balls. He says they played together and he helped her get better and better at the game. Then he also tells the reader that he's also really good at golf, and he's almost had the chance to be in a movie, but since he didn't like the movies, he felt like he really shouldn't be in them. Holden goes on to say, but Jane was a pretty funny girl. He said she wasn't strictly beautiful, but she was beautiful to him. He also mentions that she's a little muckle-mouthed, meaning that when she gets excited and begins to talk, her mouth goes in about 50 different directions, and this really makes Holden laugh. He also says she never fully closed her mouth at all times, and that when she was in a golf stance or reading a book, her mouth was always slightly open. Holden also mentions that she loves reading and she read really good books, especially poetry. Holden tells the reader that he actually shows her Allie's baseball mitt and all the poems written on it. He says she never met Allie because that was her first summer in Maine, and before that they were at Cape Cod. Holden also says that his mother really didn't like her that much, primarily because when Jane and her mother would go to the store, they really didn't talk to anyone. So Holden's mom thought they were very snobbish and very rude. Then, Holden remembers one afternoon where Jane and him were very close to necking. It was a Saturday, and it was raining very hard outside, and they were on her screened-in front porch playing checkers. He gets a little sidetracked, and at that moment, he talks about how he always wanted to kid her or make fun of her for the way she played checkers and keeping all of her kings on the back row, but he never did. He goes on to think that it's funny how all the girls he likes, he doesn't want to kid around with, and he also says it's hard to start kidding with someone if you haven't done it before. He then gets back to his story about how they were very close to making out. He said it was raining like hell and they were on the porch, and then all of a sudden her boo's stepfather comes onto the porch and asks Jane if there's any cigarettes in the house. Holden says that he never met this man before that point, but he could tell just by one look that he's the kind of guy that wouldn't want anything to do with you unless he could get something from you, and he had a really lousy personality. Holden mentions that Jane didn't say a single word and looked straight at the checkerboard the entire time. After a little bit of a pause, he finally goes back inside. Holden tries to talk to her, but she ignores even him. Then Holden notices a tear plopping out of her eye and onto the checkerboard, but she rubs it away with one of her fingers. When Holden notices this, he gets up and goes and sits next to her, practically in her lap. When he does this, she really begins to cry harder. And really without thinking, he begins to kiss her on the eyes and the nose and the forehead and her eyebrows and even her ears. However, she wouldn't let him near her mouth. Holden says that was the closest time they ever got to necking. He said that after a while, she got up and went outside and put on a red and white sweater, and they both went to the movies. He asks her if her stepfather ever tried to get wise with her. He said she was pretty young and had a terrific figure, and he wouldn't put it past someone, especially that bastard, to try something. Jane said no, and Holden never did find out what the hell the matter was. As they're walking down the street, Holden then says they make it to the movies, and during the movies they hold hands. He said that Jane was a terrific person to hold hands with because she never got antsy or bored or consistently moved. She was very sturdy and firm with her hand holding. He said that they would hold hands during the movie and they would not let go until it was finished. He also says that one time in the movies, Jane did something that just about knocked him out. He said it was during the newsreel or something, and all of a sudden he felt a hand on the back of his neck, and it was Jane's. Holden says it's a really funny thing to do because young women don't really put their hands on someone else's neck. He goes on to say it's normal for a mom or a grandmother to do, but for a young woman to do is really really unusual. Holden says that he would do this to his kid sister Phoebe every once in a while. Holden mentions that when she did it, she looked really pretty and that just about killed him. As he continued to sit in the chair, he thought about Stradlater and her, and it drove him crazy again. However, again, he knew that she wouldn't have let him get to first base, but nonetheless it still drove him crazy. He goes on to say that at that moment, there really was nobody in the lobby anymore. Even all the horrors weren't around. He then got a feeling like he wanted to get the hell out of there because it was so depressing. So he gets up and goes to his room, and he looks out the window to see if all the perverts were still in action. However, the lights on in the other rooms were all out now. He then puts his coat on and he goes down the elevator again. And he got a cab and told the driver to take him to Ernie's. He tells the reader that Ernie's is a nightclub in Greenwich Village that his brother DB used to go to, and quite frankly before he went out to Hollywood and prostituted himself. Holden mentions that DB would take him every once in a while to Ernie's to listen to the music. He says that Ernie was a big black guy and would play the piano. Holden says that he was a terrific snob and wouldn't hardly talk to anyone unless you were a big shot or a celebrity. But he could really play the piano. He said he was really good. Almost too good. This is where chapter 11 ends. Now let's dive into chapter 12. Chapter 12 starts out with Holden inside of an old cab that smells like someone had just thrown up. He goes on to say that what even made it worse is that it was so quiet and lonesome outside, even though it was Saturday night. He didn't hardly see anyone on the streets. He said you would occasionally see a man and a woman crossing the street with her arms around them, or a bunch of hoodlum-looking guys and their dates all laughing like hyenas. Holden insists what makes it worse is that when guys laugh in the middle of the night in New York and no one's around, their laughter would echo for miles. That made you feel even more lonesome and depressed. He then goes on to tell the reader that he wishes he was home so he could talk to Phoebe for a while. However, after a little silence, him and the cab driver begin to conversate, and he learns the cab driver's name is Horowitz. Holden says that Horowitz was much better than the one he had previously, and thought maybe this guy might know something about the ducks and where they go to in the winter. Holden begins to have a conversation. Holden quickly finds out that Horowitz is a very quick-tempered type of person and always responds as if he was sore about something. When Holden asks about the ducks, Horowitz says he doesn't know, and that's really a stupid thing to even ask about. Instead, Horowitz switches the conversation to the fish in the lake and what happens to them. Holden interrupts him and says, listen, the fish are different from ducks, and Horowitz asks, well, what makes them so different? Horowitz states that you need to be more efficient with your time than being concerned about the ducks. After this conversation stops for a few minutes, Holden finally relents and gives in and asks, okay, what about the fish? Horowitz turns around and says the fish don't go anywhere. They stay right in the middle of the lake. Holden says they can't just ignore the ice, they can't ignore it. And Horowitz said, who's ignoring it? Horowitz says they live right in the middle of the ice and it's their nature. They get frozen in one position for the whole winter time. After this, Holden just says, oh, and the conversation drops. A little bit later, Holden asks if Horowitz would like to stop and have a drink with him. And Horowitz answers, but he doesn't have any time for liquor. And he also asks, how old are you? And why aren't you home in bed? To which Holden responds, I'm not tired. Holden then says that soon the cab ride is over and he pays the fare and then they go. And just as he's about to step out of the cab, the driver says, listen, if you were a fish, Mother Nature would take care of you, wouldn't she? Right? You don't think that fish just die when they get into the winter time, do you? Holden tries to respond, but the cab driver interjects and says, you're goddamn right they don't. And with that, he drives off. Holden makes it to Ernie's and realizes that even though the streets are very quiet, inside Ernie's it is packed to the brim with people. He said it was so packed that he could hardly even get his coat checked at the door. Holden says that mostly the place is packed with preppy school jerks or college jerks. He makes a remark about how almost every school in the world gets out earlier for Christmas vacation than his. Holden mentions that as he's waiting, he can hear Ernie playing on the piano and thinks it's supposed to be some kind of holy song, and he mentions about how 3 couples beside him were also waiting for tables, and they were all shoving and standing on tiptoes just to look at Ernie. Holden mentions that there was a large mirror set up on the piano so that people could see Ernie's face while he was playing, and there was a big spotlight on him as well. Holden then goes on to mention that as Ernie is playing, he's adding all these riffs and high notes and everything else for the crowd, and they are just eating it up. Holden mentions that if he were any good at piano, he wouldn't add all those unnecessary notes and riffs, and in fact, he really wouldn't want anybody clapping for him. That's because when people begin to clap for you, everything starts to go to your head, and so you tend to make more mistakes. He says he almost gets up and gets out and gets his coat, but said it was too early to go back to the hotel and he didn't feel like being alone. He said that finally, he got a small stinking table right up against the wall and right beside a goddamn post. He said you couldn't see anything. It was one of those tiny ass little tables that if people sat next to you, they would never let you get up. And they usually pretty much didn't, so you had to climb over to them to get to your seat. He then said that once he got seated, he ordered a scotch and soda, which is his favorite drink, next to frozen daiquiris, of course. He also goes on to say that if you were about 6 years old, you could probably get liquor very easily at Ernie's. And it was the place to drink because it was so dark and nobody cared how old you were. He said you could even be a dope fiend and nobody would bat an eye. He then tells us that he was surrounded by jerks. And he wasn't kidding. He said that to the left of him, practically on top of him, this funny looking girl and guy were sitting very close, and they were around his age, maybe a little bit older. He said you could tell they weren't much older than him because they were being very careful when it came to drinking their drinks. They didn't want to drink it too fast and cause suspicion. Holden said he was over listening on their conversation, and essentially the guy was going on and on about a football game he had seen earlier and giving her the exact play-by-play of each moment, which made Holden laugh because he gets the feeling that this woman did not care at all for anything that he was saying. But she had to listen to him because they were on a date. Holden also mentioned that she wasn't the prettiest girl, also that the guy wasn't the most handsome of guys, so they were kind of stuck with each other. Holden then says on his right, there was this very Joe Yale looking guy with a gray flannel suit and one of those filthy tattered saw vests who goes to an Ivy League school. He said all Ivy League guys look the same and that his father wanted him to go to one, but he swears on his life he could never go to one. The first description he tells the reader is that this couple you could tell were a little tipsy. He also says the guy was feeling up the girl while he was telling her a story about how one of his roommates almost committed suicide by eating a whole bunch of aspirin. Holden says that he can hear her saying, "How terrible, please stop, don't, not here." Then he says, imagine somebody giving a feel up and telling them about a guy trying to commit suicide at the same time. That was just stupid. Holden says that compared to these two, he's starting to feel like a prized horse, even though he's sitting by himself. He said really other than drinking and smoking, there really wasn't anything else to do but listen to old Ernie. He said that as a waiter was passing by, he asked him if he could ask Ernie to join him for a drink. He tells the waiter to tell Ernie that he's DB's brother, and he thinks that that might get him to stop by. Holden says that as the waiter walks away, he could tell the waiter was never going to give Ernie the message. Holden then says all of a sudden a girl comes up to him and shouts his name. When he looks through, he realizes it was Lillian Simmons, and he tells the reader that DB used to go around with her for a while before he moved to Hollywood, as she had big breasts. He also says she was with some Navy officer who looked like he had a poker stuck up his ass. He goes on to say that she was a real phony and that really the only reason she was talking to him was to try to gather information about DB and where he was. Through their little conversation, Holden lets her know that he's in Hollywood and she marvels at this. Lillian also introduces the Navy guy to Holden, but Holden doesn't quite remember his name because he doesn't care. Although he does mention that the Navy guy has one of those very strong handshakes that almost damn near breaks your hand whenever you shake it. He goes on to say that they're having their small conversation about nothing really important. He notices that she's standing in the middle of the aisle and really blocking everyone's view and path. However, she's not really distracted or cares about this. As they're talking, she mentions how handsome Holden is getting, and how he's getting handsomer by the minute. She then asks Holden to come join them and bring his drink. Holden says that he was just leaving and that he has to meet someone. Holden tells the reader that he could tell she was just trying to get in good with him so that on the off chance when him and DB would speak, he would mention her to him. Whenever Holden says this, she immediately turns and says, "Well, tell your big brother I hate him when you see him." And then she left, and the Navy guy and him exchange pleasantries, and then they're on their way. Holden mentions that it's funny how after he meets someone, you usually have to say something nice to them, even if you really don't mean it, primarily because if you want to stay alive, that's how you had to do it. He tells the reader that he really didn't have to meet anybody, and he was kind of sad that he had said it because now he kind of had to leave, but he also couldn't stick around and join Lillian, her date, talking about nothing. He does wish that he could have stayed a little bit longer to hear Ernie play more, at least play something halfway decent. But he left and it made him a little mad, because if it hadn't been for Lillian, he would have been able to stay a little longer, and he tells the reader that people are always ruining things for you. This is where chapter 12 ends. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and as always, stay lit.